In the fall of 1997, a ranger said he saw a man standing perfectly still on a lava shelf below Windmere Tower. He never moved, just watched. 15 minutes later, he disappeared into the fog. That was the last reported sighting tied to the Daniel Everett case. And when I traced the location, it matched the others, the ones no one talks about anymore. That's when I knew I had to go back. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. If stories like this ever touched your hometown or your own family, tap like and subscribe. It helps bring light to the names the world tried to forget. I'm Rachel Everett. I was born in Douglas County, Oregon, and I spent most of my adult life working for the National Park Service. Grew up near the southern edge of Crater Lake in a house my dad built after he got out of the Navy. My mom was a school secretary. We weren't rich, but we had what we needed. I was 25 when Daniel vanished. He was only 14. That was 1984. But the forest doesn't keep time the same way people do. I was back in uniform in the fall of '97. Older maybe, more cautious, but still tethered to the place that raised me. Miles Jensen had stayed on all those years, solid quiet always with a thermos in his hand. We'd gone to high school together, then drifted apart like people do only to end up assigned to the same watch rotation 13 years later. He was the one who brought me the box. It wasn't big. Just a weathered tin with park markings and my name written on masking tape across the top. No sender, no note. Inside were copies of incident logs from the late '80s, all from the Windmere Fire Tower sector, and taped to the bottom a trail map. Outdated, marked in red pencil. I didn't say anything right away, just stared at the symbols circled near the western ridge. Bare Needle Hollow. That area had been closed off since the landslide in '89, technically off limits even to staff. Later that night, Miles and I sat outside the ranger station sharing coffee in silence. He asked if I'd heard about the new reports campers hearing voices near the tree line, strange stacked stones along the firebreak trails. I told him yes, but I didn't tell him why I believed them. That came a few days later when we spoke to Don Weaver. He'd been retired almost 10 years, living in a trailer near Grants Pass. Said he still had the original tower logs. I didn't expect much, but when I mentioned Daniel's name, something shifted behind his eyes. He said, "You're talking about the ghost." And then he told us what he saw. But that comes next. Don Weaver didn't look like much anymore. Bent at the waist liver spots on his hands, wearing a threadbare flannel with one cuff fraying open. But the moment I said Daniel's name, it was like something switched back on inside him. His fingers slowed over the coffee mug he was pouring, and his voice dropped low. "You're talking about the ghost." We were sitting outside his trailer, just outside Grants Pass, the sun setting behind the pines. He told us the story quietly, like he'd rehearsed it 1,000 times, and still wasn't sure if he believed it. Fall of '87, Windmere Tower. He was on evening watch, scanning the northwest side of the Crater Lake Basin. Fog was already starting to roll in heavy. He saw movement near the old lava shelf. At first he thought it was a tree limb swaying. Then he saw it again. A man, tall, long coat, standing perfectly still facing the tower. Wasn't hiking, Don said. Didn't have gear, didn't move. Just stood there watching. 15 minutes straight. I asked if he saw the man's face. Don hesitated. Gray beard, skin like leather. Looked like someone who hadn't slept indoors in a long time. He logged the sighting, but nothing came of it. His supervisor wrote it off as light distortion. That's when Don went into the house and came back with a small cigar box. Inside was his old tower badge, a couple dried wildflowers, and a weather log written in tight slanted handwriting. October 3rd, 1987, 6:22 p.m. Visual contact. Coordinates logged. Fog, 85% cover. No additional movement. That's when it started, Don said. The stones, the dead animals, scratches on the support beams. He told us about rocks stacked in unnatural patterns below the tower, a raccoon laid neatly across the steps. No wounds, no blood, just placed. Every time he climbed that tower after dark, he said he felt like someone was already up there waiting. When we left, he rested a hand on my arm. If your brother met him, he wouldn't have had a chance. That night back at the station, I spread Don's old coordinates across the trail maps. One by one, I began placing the known disappearance sites, Daniel's last known location, the two solo hikers from the early 80s, the young woman named Susan, the father and son from 86. Every single one clustered in a crescent shape around the western rim. But what caught my eye was the center point, Bare Needle Hollow. An old gorge no longer listed on current trail maps closed off after a series of rock slides and trail collapses in the late 80s. Landslide risk, officially unmaintained. But it was still there, tucked between two sheer ridges, hidden from the overlook and nearly impossible to reach without knowing the back route. Miles traced the fire line with his finger. There's an old maintenance path. Might still be walkable. 3 days later, we went in. Just the two of us and two younger rangers who volunteered to help survey the site. We didn't talk much during the hike. The woods were dense, heavier than I remembered. Thick fir and spruce, the air cold enough to sting when you inhaled. The birds were quiet. It wasn't just remote, it felt deliberately forgotten. When we reached the final incline, Miles paused and pointed. There, he said, past that split cedar. The gorge opened below us like a wound, narrow dark, sheltered by cliffs on either side. A natural bowl carved out of the rock. At the base, buried under ivy and half sunk into the hillside, we saw it. A collapsed structure. Rotting beams, moss-covered stone, the faint outline of a doorframe still clinging to a rusted hinge. I brushed back a curtain of vines, and there it was, carved deep into the weathered wood, H.C. Howard Clemens. He'd built this place, lived here, vanished here. The roof had caved in long ago, and the floorboards were mostly gone, chewed up by rodents and water damage. But in one corner behind a low stone wall, we found something preserved. A sealed metal box wedged tight beneath what remained of a beam. Inside a notebook, a knife worn down to a sliver, and a photograph. A woman smiling beside a truck. On the back, written in blue ink, Margaret, 1952. Miles opened the notebook carefully. The pages were dry but brittle. The handwriting was tight, methodical. No names, no dates, just observations. Hiker, male, blue backpack. Camped near Ridge 3, waited till dawn. Fire smoke too early. Wrong time. Line after line cataloged hikers' weather patrol schedules, animal sightings, an entire ecosystem of watchfulness. And then, near the back, a different kind of entry. The boy asked me my name. I said nothing. He stood still. He looked like he knew me. I turned away. I read that line twice. That could be Daniel, I said. Could be anyone, Miles replied, but he didn't sound sure. We packed the box carefully and started to make our way back up. One of the younger rangers called out from the edge of the ravine. "There's something else over here." We followed his voice. Half buried under pine needles and a scatter of stones was a torn scrap of nylon bright orange, faded with time but instantly recognizable. Daniel's backpack had been that color. I knelt beside it and brushed the soil away. My fingers hit something solid. The aluminum frame of a hiking pack, crushed but intact. Inside, we found a cracked compass, the lid of a film canister, and a small leather-bound notebook. Water damaged, but real. I held it in both hands like it might disappear. Then someone else called us over. Just a few feet away, beneath a low outcrop, someone had placed a small stack of stones, not natural, not random, underneath bones. Small ones, animal, arranged in pairs, and next to them, wrapped in waxed cloth, a torn journal page. He told me he used to be someone else. Said the world was too loud, that he came here to forget. But the memories still follow him through the trees. He said I was the first person he'd spoken to in years. He's afraid of what he's become. My throat went dry. Daniel met him, spoke to him, wrote it down. We kept going. The ravine grew darker, colder. The terrain was rough stones shifted under our feet. Roots curled out like claws. And then, in a clearing just beyond the last cluster of trees, we saw it. A grave. Shallow. Barely a mound now. The marker had long since rotted away. But the soil had been disturbed. Animal tracks had collapsed one side, but the shape was still visible. We opened it, quietly, respectfully. It wasn't deep, 2 feet at most, inside a wool coat partially decomposed. A human skeleton, and around the neck a rusted chain. Miles brushed the dirt off the dog tag. Clemens H., U.S. Army, 1944. I took a step back. If Clemens was here dead, then who had Daniel met, who had left the stacked stones and symbols beneath the fire tower in '87? Who kept watching after the man in this grave was gone? Neither of us said anything, but both of us turned slowly toward the trees. The forest didn't feel empty anymore, not even close. Back at headquarters the next morning, I sat alone in the archives room with a space heater buzzing near my boots and every overhead light off except one. The notebooks, the torn journal page, and the dog tag from Clemens's grave were spread across the table in front of me. It was quiet in that room, the kind of quiet you only notice when it starts pressing in on your ears. I kept turning over the same question if Howard Clemens died out there, sometime before the fall of '87, then who kept showing up after? Who kept building the markers and stacking the stones? Who was still watching from the tree line when Daniel disappeared in 1984? Miles said it out loud first. "There's something off in the timeline," he said. "Clemens can't be responsible for everything after that grave was dug." He was right. The sightings, the symbols, the quiet presence Don Weaver swore he saw in the fog, all that happened after Clemens was already in the ground. I went back to Daniel's waterlogged notebook. Most of the pages were illegible. The ink bled into the paper like bruises, but a few lines had survived. One entry near the middle stopped me cold. He watched me from the ridge again, said nothing. He knew I had a sister. I never told him. I read it twice. That sentence hit harder than anything else we'd found. Daniel had mentioned me, to someone, out loud, and whoever was listening, he already knew. I flipped to the next page. Another note rushed and uneven. Not Clemens. Different eyes. Younger. Stillness was different. I took out a red pen and underlined that last part. Stillness was different. Not Clemens. The more I read, the more it felt like Daniel had been trying to make sense of something he didn't recognize. I pulled out the incident logs for the park between 1980 and 1984 and started cross-referencing. Official search reports, minor injuries, solo hiker citations, a few redacted disciplinary notes. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I noticed 2 cases marked as presumed lost to terrain. Both young men, both hiking alone, both cases quietly closed within 6 months. No recoveries, no follow-up. One of the names stuck with me. Michael Lantry, 26 years old, from Northern California. Last seen near the West Rim. No fixed address, no family listed. What caught my attention wasn't the missing person report. It was the margin note scrawled beside it in faded pencil. Spoke to Clemens. Said he gave the kid water. Warned him about the ridge. That was the last known contact. I set the file aside and called Miles. "We've been looking in the wrong direction," I said. "I don't think Daniel ran into Clemens. I think he ran into someone who came after." Miles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think someone else took his place?" "I think someone found that cabin after Clemens died. I think someone stayed." When we returned to Bare Needle Hollow that afternoon, we brought more staff and widened the search radius. The ravine was still dangerous, unsteady slopes, hidden roots, slick shale. We moved slow and careful. That's when the second team found it. North side, just past a bend in the trail that had half collapsed in a rockfall decades ago. Beneath a moss-covered boulder, they uncovered a sealed tin canister packed with bones. Small ones. Birds, rabbits, maybe a squirrel. But what chilled me were the carvings packed inside tiny figurines, each one whittled from different wood, each with a long diagonal slash across where the face should have been. There were 7 of them, and one was different. Taller, no slash, smooth face. Rachel, one of the junior rangers, turned to me and asked, "Why isn't this one marked like the others?" I didn't answer. Not right away. We cataloged the site, logged the coordinates, flagged the area for restricted access. I took the figurines back to headquarters and laid them out across the table. 6 were nearly identical. Simple, crude, unsettling in their repetition. The 7th looked newer, more careful. It didn't take me long to think it might represent Daniel. And if it did, what did that mean? That night, a call came through from the film lab in Medford. It was Elias Harper, a soft-spoken tech who'd agreed to process the film we'd recovered from Daniel's broken camera. "You'll want to see this," he said. "There's one frame that stood out." We drove down early the next morning. The lab was cold and dim with metal shelves and humming equipment. Elias led us into a small viewing room and turned on the projector. The image filled the screen slowly. A campfire. Stones arranged in a circle. Daniel's tent partly zipped. A water bottle. Pine needles strewn across the ground. But just off-center behind the trees was something else. A figure. Almost missed him at first, half-shrouded, partially turned, caught mid-step. But one shoulder and part of the face were visible. Long hair, thick beard, rugged jacket. And one eye just barely reflecting the flash, sharp, focused, watching. Elias tried to enhance the image, boosted the contrast, adjusted the levels. The face never fully came into view, but one thing did. A scar, thin, diagonal cutting across the right cheek. I scribbled it down in my notebook. Miles leaned closer. "He's carrying something," he said. "A harness or a strap across his chest." "Can we identify him?" I asked. "Maybe," Elias said. "You've got enough to cross-check." Back at the station, I went through local arrest records from the early 80s. It took 4 hours. But I found him. Booking photo, 1980. Jackson County Sheriff's Department. Arrested for illegal camping and vandalism. Charges dropped. His name was listed as Michael Lantry. Same man, same scar, same face. He'd vanished a year later, but no one had connected it to anything. Until now. I pulled out Daniel's notebook again and read the line one more time. He told me he used to be someone else. The world was too loud. He came here to forget. Michael Lantry didn't vanish. He disappeared by choice. And someone followed him into the dark. We just hadn't understood that yet. By the time we returned to Bare Needle Hollow, the weather had turned. The air carried a sharpness I hadn't felt in years, not quite cold, but still enough to pull at your skin. Miles had brought in 3 more staff to assist the expanded search. The others moved with purpose, checking terrain, marking elevation changes, combing through brush in a systematic grid. I stayed back. Not out of fear, but because I needed to feel the ground again under my own pace. I moved slowly along the northern edge, watching the slope, the tree line, the places where animal trails bled into human paths. There was no breeze. Even the needles underfoot were still. One of the younger rangers radioed in a find north of the ravine behind a narrow outcrop where a recent windstorm had exposed a tangle of roots. I walked over, crouched beside him, and helped move aside the moss-covered stones. Beneath them was another crude circle, flat rocks arranged like a broken compass with a single post driven through the center. It wasn't new. The wood had darkened with time, the edges softened by rain, but it was intact. Leather cords had once been tied to the post, now frayed and brittle. Something was still attached, a square of faded orange cloth. I didn't need to ask. It was the same type of nylon Daniel's backpack had been made from. I stepped closer, eyes on the carvings that covered the surface of the post. Initials scratched in over and over again, DW. Some shallow, some carved deep. Miles walked up behind me and didn't say anything right away. His eyes were scanning the same patterns. He kept coming back, I murmured. This wasn't left once. It was visited. Miles touched the post lightly with his gloved hand. Same knife, probably. Could be the one from Clemens's box. The others had gathered behind us. I opened my field notebook and started recording the markings, angles, depth, spacing. Then I noticed something else. Symbols, not letters. They looked almost childlike. A spiral. A square. A faceless human shape. I didn't recognize them, but they'd been scratched in with purpose. Not decoration. Not random. That night we flew in someone from the Cultural Survey Division. Dr. Lyndon Ash, early 50s. Glasses around her neck on a cord, spoke softly and carried a notepad thicker than mine. She'd cataloged hundreds of indigenous petroglyphs and off-grid symbols from survivalist communities. We showed her the post first. She studied it for a long time before speaking. These aren't tribal, she said. They're synthetic. Someone invented this system. They were untrained but deliberate. She pointed to the spiral. That's often used to represent loops. Repetition. Return. The square might be shelter. Containment. And this figure... She paused. This could be either the one who watches or the one being watched. Possibly both. We expanded the search zone that afternoon. 20 yards beyond the post, beneath a thicket of thorn brush, we found another arrangement. Stones again this time in a rough arch, like an open door. Inside, a shallow depression had been dug out and lined with bones, always in pairs, one larger one, smaller, laid, facing each other. None were human, but the care in their placement made it clear this was ritual, not survival. Miles knelt next to me. She was replacing them, he said quietly, or mimicking them. I didn't correct him. The woods were starting to lean in now. Each discovery narrowed something I couldn't yet name. That evening I sat alone in the incident room with the figurines again. 7 total. 6 of them carved crudely, one smoother, taller, its face left untouched. The slash was missing. I lined them up across the desk. In that context, the difference stood out more. If the slash marked those who had been claimed, why was this one spared? I turned it over slowly in my hand. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew what I was thinking. What if this one wasn't carved for someone, but by someone? What if it wasn't a victim, but a witness? The phone rang. I picked up and heard Miles's voice on the other end. "That film we pulled from Daniel's camera," he said. "Medford just called back. There's more." We met Elias at the lab the next morning. He didn't say much, just led us into the back room and dimmed the lights. On the screen, a new image. Not of Daniel, not directly. A campfire, a tent. You could just make out the edge of a boot. But the focus wasn't on that. Off-center in the dark space between 2 trees was a figure, not facing the camera. Half-turned, caught mid-step. Just one eye visible, glinting with the flash. A beard, long hair, and across the right cheek unmistakable even in blur, one long scar. Miles leaned forward. "That's not Daniel." "No," I said. "It's Lantry." Elias enhanced what he could, pulled the shadows back where the contrast would allow. You could see a strap across the chest, a rough-looking coat, something that could have been a satchel or a harness. The face never fully turned, but it didn't have to. We had enough. When we returned to headquarters, I ran the name through the missing persons registry again. Michael Lantry, arrested 1980, Jackson County, vandalism, illegal camping, no fixed address, released without charge, gone the following summer, and according to Clemens's own log note, last seen alive by him near the ridge. I opened Daniel's journal again, found the same line now with context. He told me he used to be someone else. The world was too loud. He came here to forget. This wasn't chance. This wasn't a hiker lost to terrain. Michael Lantry didn't vanish. He made a choice. He stepped into the woods and let the rest of the world fall away. And Daniel met him there. What happened next would come later. But in that moment, I stopped thinking of my brother as a boy who was taken, and started to wonder if he might have followed. 3 days later, we went back in. Not to chase something, but to retrace it step by step, movement by movement. We had the photo now, the campfire, the tent, the figure watching from the trees. I used that frame like a map, studying every visible detail. The slope of the ground, the shadows cast by the flame, the angle of the tent flap. We ran it through topo overlays and narrowed the possibilities to a bluff just south of the eastern ridge. It took the better part of the morning, but eventually we found it. The same fire ring, now long dead. Same stone placement. Same pattern of roots twisting around the edge of the clearing. Miles crouched beside the char line and tapped the earth. Someone came through here more than once, he said. Look at the ground. See this? That's repetition. Not a single camp. A pattern. 10 feet away, hidden under a fallen branch, we found what was left of a tarp shelter, partially collapsed, mold blooming through the seams. Inside were signs of occupancy, animal bones, flattened bedding, half a pack of water purification tablets that had long since expired. I stepped further in toward the rear wall of the outcrop. That's where I saw it. A tree nearly consumed by moss, but with fresh gouges on the exposed bark. 2 sets of initials carved side by side. DWML. Miles said it out loud. He marked it. I stepped back, like he wanted someone to remember. We radioed the others to log the coordinates and preserve the site. Then, just as we turned to head back down the slope, we heard it. A sound not made by wind or animal. A footstep. Deliberate. Then another. Behind us, higher up on the ridge. Miles turned first, scanning the tree line. I kept still, my ears straining to pick up what my eyes couldn't. The forest held its breath. Then came a second sound, not movement this time. A whistle. Low, 3 tones. Almost musical. Then silence again. Miles raised his voice carefully. If you're hurt, we can help you. This is the Park Service. No answer. The others hadn't radioed in. No one else was scheduled to be in that section of the hollow. I pulled my flashlight from my belt but didn't switch it on. Miles whispered, "Let's move." Slowly. We tracked the direction of the sound following an uneven footpath half covered in pine litter. It wasn't a trail maintained by rangers. Too narrow. Too hidden. This was made by someone who moved through these woods often and never wanted to be followed. About a 1/4 mile and the path split. To the left, it curved down toward a dry creek bed. To the right, it climbed toward a wide moss-covered boulder with an opening beneath it just large enough to shelter beneath. We split. Miles went right. I moved left, radio on, but turned low. The creek bed was cold and quiet. I saw no tracks, no recent signs of movement. Then Miles's voice crackled in my earpiece. "Rachel, you need to see this." I turned back and climbed fast, pulling myself over roots slick with rain from the night before. When I reached the hollow, Miles was standing just outside the opening. He didn't speak, just pointed. I stepped inside. The walls were low, more like a cave than a shelter. At the center was a fire ring, long extinguished, its edges blackened but still intact. Beside it, covered in bark and rotted fabric, was a stack of notebooks, and along the stone face at the back of the hollow, hundreds of carvings. Tiny human faces etched in with something sharp. Each one blank. No eyes, no expression. Just smooth sockets over and over again. And beneath them, scratched deeper than the rest, one phrase repeated like a chant. You forget the face, but it never forgets you. I whispered it aloud without meaning to. Miles opened one of the notebooks. The pages were full, some orderly, some nearly unreadable. A mix of observation and confession. Ranger patrols, hiker movements, wind patterns, names of those who passed too close. Then near the center, an image. A sketch. Daniel. Sitting at a fire staring directly ahead. The detail was rough but unmistakable. His face had been scratched out. I turned to another notebook. Same pattern. Tracking data, personal entries, notes about fire noise light, and near the end of that one, a small line written sideways in the margin. She's coming. She always comes. Miles looked at me but didn't speak. I could feel my pulse in my teeth. We bagged the notebooks carefully and hiked out in silence. That night, back at HQ, a technician scanned each page using infrared. Some lines had been layered over with charcoal. Hidden beneath the ink under the phrase about my return was another sentence. Written smaller, fainter. I knew she would find me again. The final notebook in the stack had no dates, no structure, just one broken timeline, fragmented entries about Daniel. What he wore, where he camped, how often he spoke, what he cooked. The language was disjointed. Some lines bordered on incoherence, but the last entry was clear. It was dated July 16th, 1984. And it read, I had to choose. No other context. Just 4 words. Beneath it, scribbled into the corner of the page so hard it had torn through the paper, a second phrase. One stays. One sees. We didn't sleep much that night. Miles left to check on the secured evidence lockers. I stayed and ran my hand across the smooth edge of the final page, trying to imagine what Daniel had felt alone in those woods with someone nearby who called himself no one. When I closed the journal, the air in the room felt wrong. Still. Too still. Like something in the forest was listening. And waiting. The day after we decoded the journal's final entry, I went back to Clemens's original cabin alone. The others were still cataloging the materials we'd recovered from the hollow, but I couldn't sit under fluorescent lights anymore. I needed to stand where it began, if not for Daniel, then for whoever came before or after. The structure hadn't changed since we found it. Still half sunken into the hillside, the roof collapsed inward, the floor brittle and damp. But something had been gnawing at me for days. In the first report we logged, we noted that part of the floor was still intact, thicker boards reinforced over bedrock. It struck me as unusual. If Clemens had built this himself, why reinforce just one section? I tapped each plank one by one. Most echoed with dull, solid resistance, but near the back wall 2 boards rang hollow. I slid my knife between the seams and pried them up slowly. Beneath them, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a reel of audio tape. No label, no case, just bound tightly and tucked deep in the cavity. I didn't open it there. I resealed the floor and carried it straight to base. We still had a functioning reel-to-reel in the research room, barely. Miles helped thread it through the spindle and we sat side by side without speaking. The machine clicked. Then a faint whir. Then the hiss of static. And then voice. Male. Rough. The words strained and uneven as though spoken through clenched teeth or cracked lips. He keeps talking in his sleep. Keeps saying my name, but he never met me. He doesn't know I was watching. A pause. Then a longer breath. Sometimes I wonder if he sees me. Not out there. In here. Inside the dark part of the fire. Miles leaned forward. The voice continued lower this time, almost whispering. I never wanted to hurt him. I just wanted him to understand. But he ran. He ran into the trees. So I followed. The last words weren't clear, washed out by static and degradation, but I heard enough to recognize the same phrase from the journal. She always comes. The tape stopped. I sat still for a long time, staring at the reel's end flapping gently in its loop. That voice, it wasn't Clemens. It was younger, sharper, more uncertain. Lantry. I believed that now. And Daniel had spoken to him, had written about him, had trusted him at least briefly. What happened after? We still didn't know. That evening, I returned to the fire tower alone. Windmere Lookout. The same one where Don Weaver reported the ghost. From the top, Crater Lake spread out like a mirror too still to be natural. The sun hadn't yet dipped below the ridge, but shadows were already creeping across the basin. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the one unmarked figurine, the one I believed Daniel had carved. I set it on the railing facing the trees. You're not forgotten, I said. A wind passed through the pines. Thin, cold. It sounded almost like breath. I didn't move. Not yet. Because down below, between two trunks I hadn't noticed before, something shifted. A flicker. Then gone. Could have been shadow. Could have been wind. But I knew better by now. My radio buzzed. Miles's voice crackled through. Rachel, you still at the tower? Yes, I answered. I saw something. North slope. He didn't hesitate. I'm heading your way. Stay there. I waited, but only a moment. Something had changed. The pull I'd felt in the hollow was different now, less like a warning, more like an opening. As if the forest, after all this time, was no longer resisting my presence, but allowing it. I left the tower without turning on my flashlight. My boots found the ridge trail by memory, and I followed it west, away from the tower lights, into the places the park never mapped. The air grew denser, quieter. No insects, no wind. Just the dull hum of stillness beneath my footsteps. I crossed the old fire line and reached the grove with the carved post. The initials were there, DW over and over. But now fresh prints in the pine needles too large for deer, too narrow for bear. I followed them, deeper, beyond where we'd previously marked. Past the limits of the topographical overlay, the trail descended into a clearing I hadn't seen before, and at its center, flat stone worn smooth, shaped like an altar. On top of it, a photograph. Next to it, a journal. I stepped forward slow and steady. The photo showed a man mid-30s maybe, thin, unshaven, face, hollow eyes distant. It was Daniel. Not as I'd remembered him, but older, changed. I turned the photo over, written in pencil. He let me go, but I never left. Behind me, a dry voice broke the silence. I didn't take him. He stayed. I turned. A man stood at the tree line, long beard, scar across the cheek, same coat from the fire photo. Lantry. He didn't speak right away, just pointed to the journal. He wrote that after I told him everything, told him what I asked. Lantry stepped forward but kept his distance. That the world out there, it has rules. Expectations, noise. But in here you can forget who you were. I looked back at the photo. Is he still alive? He looked toward the trees. He was, maybe still is, but not like before. He found quiet. Then he said one more thing. You shouldn't look for him anymore. I didn't answer. I picked up the photo, held it tight in my hand, because I knew what I had to do next. The search wasn't over, not yet. But it was no longer about rescue. It was about understanding what Daniel had seen and why, when given the chance, he chose to disappear into it. I stood in that clearing for a long while, the photograph of Daniel clutched in my palm, the leather journal at my side, the scent of pine and damp earth settling around me. Lantry didn't move from the shadow line, just stood at the edge of the trees, face half obscured beneath the tangled beard and the old coat, that scar splitting his cheek in the half-light. For a moment I thought he might say more, but he only nodded once and faded back into the woods, the needles barely stirring as he passed. I opened the journal and paged through with careful hands. The entries inside were sparse, uneven. Sometimes nothing but a few words. Sometimes long, rambling observations about the forest, the sound of rain, the pattern of stars through a break in the clouds, the way the wind moved through the hollow. There were passages written in Daniel's hand, lines about losing track of days, about the relief of not having to speak, about the strange comfort in following routines that had no witness. There were also entries in a second-hand, sharper, more urgent Lantry's. He wrote about the silence, about the weight of memory, about how watching someone else choose the same path he had chosen years before made him question whether he'd ever been alone out there. I read a passage where Daniel described waking at dawn and seeing Lantry sitting by the fire carving another faceless figurine, neither of them speaking, just letting the cold seep in. One page described the choice the word repeated again and again, choice, 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 as if Daniel was trying to convince himself he'd made one. In another, Lantry confessed to feeling watched by something older than either of them, as if the hollow itself was studying them both. It was not a story of violence or abduction, not the nightmare I'd imagined for decades. It was a slow unraveling, a surrender to quiet, to being unseen and unremarked by the outside world. The final pages were written by Daniel alone, and the handwriting grew more scattered, sometimes almost illegible. "I didn't want to leave," he wrote. "I just wanted everything to stop." The words struck me as I read them there beneath the trees. No bird song, no wind. The stillness stretching so tight it felt like the air might split. I closed the journal and tucked it under my arm. The sun was beginning to set, the light slipping away, the clearing turning gray at the edges. I started back along the trail, retracing my steps toward the hollow's edge. Halfway up the ridge, I stopped and looked back. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a shape at the base of the stone altar, a figure hunched unmoving, watching the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. At headquarters that night, Miles and I sat in the darkened research room with the journal between us. I didn't tell him everything Lantry had said. I wasn't sure I could find the words for it yet, but I let him read the last few pages. He sat with his hands folded and his brow low, reading in silence for a long time. When he finished, he placed the book on the table and looked at me, his expression heavy. "We never understood what we were looking for, did we?" he said. "Not really." I shook my head. He wasn't taken. He was offered something. We didn't talk much after that. Some nights when the wind picked up and rattled the blinds, I would think of that hollow of Lantry and Daniel, of all the ones who had chosen quiet over return. I thought of the faceless figurines of the post etched over and over with Daniel's initials, of the strange, almost reverent care that had gone into marking each place where someone had stayed. I wondered how many others the forest had taken in not by force, but by invitation. The next morning I returned one last time to the site. The trail was clear, the prints from the previous night already softened by dew. I placed Daniel's photo back atop the stone beside the figurine, a small memorial in the heart of the place that had claimed him. I whispered his name into the cold just once and let it drift upward through the pines. Then I turned and made my way out, not looking back, the echo of Lantry's words carrying me all the way to the edge of the woods. He found quiet, but there was something in the silence now that hadn't been there before. Not comfort, not grief. Something waiting as if the story wasn't finished. and maybe in some way it never would be. In the days that followed, word spread through the district offices about what we'd found in Bare Needle Hollow, but the details were met with a kind of practiced silence from law enforcement and park administrators alike. Officially, the investigation was closed with the confirmation of Daniel's handwriting and the presence of Lantry, a missing person himself, whose own trail had dissolved into nothing decades earlier. Files were updated, case statuses changed, but there were no charges, no prosecution, no reward for anyone. The authorities called it a voluntary disappearance, one of those cold legal phrases meant to box up something too strange or too sad for the paperwork to bear. I let them. There was nothing left in me that wanted a trial, nothing that would have come from courtrooms or headlines or the empty ritual of closure. I watched the evidence boxes get sealed and placed into long-term storage. Daniel's journal. The last photograph, the carved figurines, and the reel of tape all vanished into chain of custody cabinets in a basement room with a metal door that stuck on humid days. The forest, too, seemed to absorb the news with its own unhurried patience. No new stone markers appeared, no more reports of voices in the tree line or campsites disturbed. For a while, the hollow was quiet. The other rangers stopped asking about the missing, the search grids, the strange footprints. New hires came in for the summer season and took over the trails with radios and checklists and the nervous enthusiasm of people who hadn't yet seen what time could do to a place. Miles took a transfer to a coastal park that spring. His goodbye was quiet, a handshake in the break room, a thermos of coffee set on my desk, and a folded note that just said, "If you ever need a second pair of boots, call." Dr. Ash sent me an email a few weeks later, a brief update that the symbols and figurines we'd recovered had been cataloged and stored with the rest of the Unsolved. "They're not alone on the shelf," she wrote. I visited the hollow one last time before the end of the season. It was late afternoon, the air thick with the smell of moss and rain. I carried with me the last unmarked figurine, the one I believed Daniel had made. The ground had softened, and each step I took seemed to settle into the hush that had fallen over that entire stretch of ridge. I knelt at the base of the altar stone, placed the figurine beside the faded photograph, and whispered a name. No bird sang. The forest seemed to listen. I thought of all the years I had searched for answers, the miles walked, the files combed, the faces of strangers whose names I'd read only in passing. I thought of Daniel's choice, the way he wrote about the silence as both comfort and prison, the way Lantry had described forgetting who he was in order to survive. Some things I realized would never belong to the world outside those trees. On my way back out, I met a group of hikers at the old trailhead. They'd gotten turned around after a rain and were glad for directions. None of them recognized my name or asked about the search. I pointed them toward the marked paths and watched as they disappeared, laughter echoing behind them, boots leaving nothing but temporary imprints in the soft earth. When I got back to my truck, I found Miles's note in my pocket again. I reread it and folded it back into my wallet, the ink nearly worn away. I didn't call him. Some kinds of company you have to find for yourself, and some stories aren't meant to be shared a second time. That evening, as the sun went down behind the ridge, I sat on my porch and listened to the wind in the pines. It sounded almost like a song, 3 notes low and steady. In the hush, I understood that the forest would always keep its secrets, that some echoes never fully die away. Daniel's disappearance was never solved in any way that made sense to the outside world, but for those of us who carried the story, there was a kind of peace in knowing he had chosen quiet. The truth, such as it was, would live between the trees and in the names scratched on old posts in the spaces left behind where someone had once been. I let the last light fade from the porch and went inside, closing the door softly behind me. The forest settling again just beyond the window, unchanged and unchanging, waiting for the next story to begin. Sometimes when the house is quiet and the forest is nothing but a dark outline beyond the windows, I find myself thinking about all the years that led me here. I think about Daniel, my brother, who vanished into the silence of Bare Needle Hollow, who chose a kind of life the rest of us could never really understand. For a long time, I thought closure meant answers, that if I just found the right trail, the right clue, I could bring him back, or at least make sense of what was lost. But the truth is, some stories never fully close. They settle into the landscape and the spaces inside us, reshaping the way we see the world, making room for both grief and gratitude. Miles calls now and then from the coast, usually with nothing more urgent than a weather update or a stray memory. We don't talk about the case anymore. That part of our lives lives elsewhere in a journal locked away, a figurine resting at the foot of an altar stone, a whistle sometimes carried by the wind. The park brought in new rangers, younger ones who didn't know the names or faces. The hollow grew back over trails, fading the forest, reclaiming what it always meant to keep. I don't visit often, but when I do, I go quietly. I walk the boundary, let the air settle, and remember Daniel not as someone who disappeared, but as someone who chose quiet and left a mark none of us could erase. There's no one to blame and no one left to chase. What I carry now is different. Not a hunt for justice or revenge, but a kind of respect for how people survive, and how sometimes the hardest choice is to let someone go their own way. If you've listened this far, thank you for giving time to a story that's mostly silence. If someone you loved ever slipped out of reach, whether into the woods or somewhere lonelier, just know you're not alone. Every family has its own echoes, and every echo matters. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it or leave a comment with a name you want remembered. Sometimes just saying it out loud is enough to bring someone home, even if only for a moment.